Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome. My name is John Lash. I'm the pastor of Greenhouse Church here in South Florida, and joining me is...
I'm Jaleesa Joseph. I'm the missions coordinator here at Greenhouse Church, South Florida.
So here we are. If you've looked at the title, it is Jesus, Mary, and Ahmaud Arbery. If you're like, what in the world? All right, let me frame this conversation before we dive in here. This past week, my mom and I got to share actually this pulpit stage table for Mother's Day. And we regularly do an episode of our podcast, which if you're not subscribed, you're welcome to do so. Wherever you find your podcast, search Greenhouse South Florida, you'll find us there. We often do an episode called Bonus Thoughts, which is essentially I, as a preacher, communicator who is prone to verbosity, almost always have more things to say than I was actually able to say based off of time constraints in my sermon. And so we kind of rehash thoughts. This week was no exception. In fact, this week, I really had a thought which I realized would open up a window that would take me probably 10 minutes to dive into. Mm-hmm. And it was Mother's Day, and my mom was taking the majority of the real estate as she deserved to be honored. And she did also.
So
I mean, my mom
check
was
out the sermon if you have
fantastic.
not checked it out.
But I wanted to open up that window. I felt it was deeply important for our church family, and hopefully if you're not a part of Greenhouse South Florida church family, thrilled that you're here. Hopefully it's helpful to you as well. My core thought was, what does Jesus and his interaction with Mary, his mom, and John, the beloved disciple, have to do with Ahmaud Arbery? And so that's kind of where I want us to go, specifically dealing with this moment and the overall sort of race relations and racial climate in America. So I'm going to share some of my thoughts, which will be a little bit more of like me just kind of, bear with me, passion, just
He's
going
getting
for
it out,
it.
everyone.
I'm getting it out. This is
out.
like a group catharsis. And then I'd love, Jaleesa, for you to share your heart, your perspective, and hopefully have us in some ways maybe model a dialogue that ideally the diverse family of God, because to be clear, God's family is diverse. It's every tribe, every tongue, and every nation, is doing with different perspectives and different life experiences, but we're family, and we're doing it in love. So
let us model, hopefully, what the church as a
hopefully, I mean, we're not gold standard,
perfect,
but it's honest. It's honest. It's real.
We'll be real.
These are genuine conversations.
Sure.
So I'll give you my take here. I am obviously a melanin-challenged individual, right? I'm a white dude. I'm from a Jewish background. I had a very interesting upbringing, and as far as here in South Florida, which is a whole hodgepodge melting pot. And so since Trayvon Martin, really, I've sort of been on a journey of learning and being a student. I was teaching at Eastside High School. I was an English teacher in Gainesville. My student demographic was 90+% African American and Hispanic. And so I remember Trayvon Martin happening. All of my students basically were distraught. And I, if I'm being honest, I cared about my students, but I was genuinely confused. And so it began this process of asking questions, of hearing stories, and honestly of kind of sitting pretty regularly in stunned, heartbroken silence at the abundance of stories I began to hear. And so I want to frame this like this. Oftentimes, I think we get duped into a conversation that is not God's conversation. So at the end of the day, when it comes to justice issues, if you remember, we did a whole Jesus, Justice, and Diversity series. Justice is not about politics. Justice is about God. And so it all goes back to, if you don't follow Jesus, you're like, that's fine, listen in on some family time here. If you follow Jesus, justice biblically all goes back to the judge. And so when we're talking about this, we're not talking about, well, what's the conservative agenda? Well, what's the liberal agenda? Or what's the independent agenda? There's probably more political parties. I'm not particularly a strongly political guy. I am a Jesus guy and I'm a justice guy, though. And so I think we go back there. And what we know about God is that he tells us his family is diverse. It's every tribe, it's every tongue, it's every nation. What we also know about God, and what we're going to get into this week in our new sermon series about deep relationships, is that we are called to rejoice with those who rejoice and to mourn with those who mourn. It's been helpful for me. It's one of the reasons why I really love our little church family here at Greenhouse, and specifically Greenhouse South Florida. I know the people. So this makes it a little easier because I know whether I'm getting good questions or bad questions or infuriating questions, they are by and large genuine questions. And so I've gotten some very genuine questions over the past few days as a white pastor with a diverse congregation, some very genuine, I would say tough honest, real questions. And I think genuine questions deserve genuine answers.
Yeah.
And so that's the purpose of sort of this time right now. So let me give my disclaimer. This will be my attempt, which will be a very imperfect one, to get out the way I've been processing, and I'm still in the process of processing and learning. So thank you in advance for the grace. I will inadvertently say some things, miss some things, try to parrot back some things that I've learned. You're like, that's not, I'm so sorry, forgive me. I'm still on this journey trying to learn and process. And I've only gotten here because at this point of countless conversations with friends and members of our church family who are people of color who have been gracious enough to share out of their pain and their experiences.
Yeah.
And so,
and can I say just really
yeah.
quick before you start, just for people of color out there, obviously I am a Black woman. Hello. So something that I think I've been hearing a lot in our community, especially, is like when it comes to Christianity, like the white man's religion, and then you're having a dialogue with someone, John, who's admitted like, hey, he's white and he's like growing. So I think as a person of color, it's good to have this dialogue, like we mentioned before, and just know, like, God cares about all this. Like John said, like, I just want to point that out. Like, it's just a bold-faced lie that, like, God cares more about a white man than a Black person or anything. So just to speak to anyone out there that might be tuning in and it's just like, you're like maybe ready to swipe or something and you're like, nah, this white dude's trying to talk. It's like, no, like, we're just trying to have an open dialogue and a conversation because God cares about every single one of us. He cares about diversity, and we're just hoping that this dialogue here will just mimic what we want to see, and what God honestly cares about is just every single person. And he grieves and mourns with what has happened. So I'm excited to dive into this with you, John, as far as just like, it's beautiful to see someone grieving and mourning over someone that looks like me who doesn't look like me, if that makes sense. So I have my heart open, and I hope that you guys are too.
Yeah.
So cool.
Yeah, and I just realized too, if you're like, who is Ahmaud Arbery? Google it.
Yeah.
From this, I was gonna try to get into the whole thing. I'm like, I just can't. Just Google it. Okay, so here's where I want to start. As followers of Jesus, we talk about it all the time at Greenhouse. We want to help ordinary people become passionate followers of Jesus, which means our endeavor is to be like Jesus. We want to pray like Jesus. We want to live like Jesus. We want to love like Jesus. We want to walk like Jesus. We hit that a lot. What I kind of wanted to go in my sermon, and where I want to go is kind of these bonus thoughts afterwards, is I'd actually like us to learn to be like John in this story. Here's where I'm like, I almost jumped into it in the middle of my mom talking. I'm like, you can't interrupt your mom. Here's a lot of what I've seen. Some with Ahmaud Arbery, definitely a lot, whether it was Eric Gardner or Philando Castile or this long list of names that's heartbreaking that it is just so long.
Yeah.
Has been people saying, well, we don't have all the facts yet. You get people who are deeply grieving, and you start going into, well, we don't have, like, here's what I find interesting about John. Mary was there weeping as this person, her son whom she loves, has been murdered, and he's innocent. And John doesn't say, well, Mary, I mean, you know he's going to come back from the dead. Mary, you know, I mean, we don't have all the facts yet. I mean, you know Jesus, he was, he said some wild things. We don't, like John does, what does John do as the beloved disciple? He stands next to Mary in her tears and mourns with her.
Yeah.
And so I think often and I've been very guilty of this at times, jumping in with my head before I sat in with someone with my heart.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good.
And so that's been one of the biggest learning lessons for me when I'm sharing, I hope I'm trying to share my heart honestly, because this is a journey that I've been on and I'm still on. We learn from John what it looks like to stand with someone in their grief and mourn with someone who mourns. And he mourned as much as he could, right? He knew Jesus, he loved Jesus. It was not the same depth of a mother, but he at least tried. And I think there's something beautiful about sitting in that space and just sitting with someone, feeling with that person. At this point, I'm like, man, if I hear another white person respond to another black member of our church family who is hurting deeply and mourning with, well, we don't know all the facts, I will slap you in the face in Jesus' name. And then I'll pray for healing, okay? But
and then ask for forgiveness.
Just don't, I'm playing, but I'm serious. Like, that's not the time. Like, I think what we see in John is like, yes, he got it. When someone is mourning and grieving, you don't tell them, oh, well, you don't know, like, you mourn, you love them.
Yeah.
If you care about them, you love them, you mourn and grieve with them. So that's one, just like, I just had to get that one out.
Yeah.
It's learning empathy, especially when you don't understand. You feel it before you try to fix it. And you sit with that person. The second thought is this, and I've gotten a few genuine, and this is, again, why I love, this is the genius, by the way, of the church, which Jaleesa alluded to it. Just in case you've heard, the church, some of the founding fathers of the church were Middle Eastern and African. Yeah. They were not white dudes. So if you're like, the church is the way of Jesus is a white people thing, I'm like, you've been lied to. I'm sorry. Just empirically, historically, you've been lied to. I've had
Google that too.
You can Google that one too. I've had from members of our faith family and beyond asking genuine questions. Like, I had one question, I loved it, and it was genuine. They're like, John, I see everyone posting the picture of this guy, talking about Ahmaud Arbery. Did you know him? And the question, I think, is a good one, because I think it is a genuine confusion, oftentimes from white people who are not people of color. Like, what I see all this going on, what is the correlation that you've made with this guy that you don't know?
Yeah.
So let me tell you a story that I hope will open up maybe a window of understanding, and that I'd love all your thoughts, Jaleesa.
Yeah.
I was talking with a friend who's a pastor who's black, and we were in a meeting. It was, a big meeting, and all this stuff was happening. And I've had enough conversations at this point with members of our church family who are people of color and friends to know, if you are a black person right now, there is a high chance that you are feeling lots of feelings. So we're in this meeting, and it's mostly white pastors, and no one's really said anything about. And so in my mind, I'm like, this is the huge elephant in the room. So I just and I was like, oh man, this is, like, you don't know where people stand. You don't know how much people are going to politicize stuff. And there's other pastors in the room. And I'm this young guy. I'm like, And I just knew, I'm like, Holy Spirit, if I don't say something, I'm disobeying and grieving the Holy Spirit. I just knew it.
Yeah.
So at the very end of the meeting, I wish I could say I was so courageous. And I went at the very end of the meeting, I'm like, hey guys, I just got to say something. And I didn't say anything crazy profound. I was just like, hey, we're here in South Florida. We're in a multicultural community. We're endeavoring to lead, or we want to lead multicultural churches. Let's just all realize that members of our family that we love, our church family, are feeling and mourning deeply, and we're called biblically to mourn with those who mourn. I said, can we just pray for that as we wrap up? It was on National Day of Prayer or something. So it was crickets. And I was like, I'll pray, and I prayed, and I'm not like some racial reconciliation expert. I'm not but I love our church. I love people. I'm trying to, at least. And the meeting ends. I'm like, oh my gosh, I think I might get kicked out of this group. Like, what's gonna happen? It was so awkward. And I got a phone call from one of the guys in this group. It's not majority black or people of color, who said, hey, thank you so much for saying that. 2 weeks ago, I was riding my bike, got pulled off my bike, basically racially profiled, and I've been wrestling as a pastor, with my peers here, with just my heart. It's like, I just don't want my heart to get, and it opened up this whole dialogue.
Yeah.
And here's, I guess, the last thing I would like to say that's just on my heart is because I think a lot of our churches genuinely we love one another, but how do we do this? I don't want to say the wrong things. What's the right thing? How do we even think about this? Each time another name gets added to the list, Ahmaud Arbery being the latest, and all of this is starting to come to light really with cell phone videos, it seems like. It's not like it's just started happening. Where did this start happening? It's probably always been happening.
Yeah.
Each time another name gets tragically added to the list, it's like a Band-Aid gets ripped off of an open wound. And so it's about Ahmaud Arbery, but it's not just about Ahmaud Arbery.
Yeah.
It's about all of it. And so every time I sit down, and I've tried to just make a point, by the way, here's a very practical, if you are not a person of color and you're interacting with a person of color and they are upset, here's a great thing to say. You seem really upset. Would you like to talk about it?
Yeah.
And then you listen.
Yeah.
So that's what I've been trying to do. I'm like, I don't know what to say. I don't want to say the wrong thing. You can't go wrong with that.
Yep.
Hey, you seem really upset. Would you like to talk about it? They might say no. Okay. But they might say yes. Then you shut up and listen. And so the more I've done that, the more I realize, like with my pastor friend, he was feeling Ahmaud Arbery, but it was connected to an experience he had.
Yeah.
And the more I talk to people, it's like every one of these moments brings up multiple heartbreaking stories of racial profiling, of discrimination, of a very differing experience that I experienced, of very differing stories that they had with their parents that I never even thought of having with my parents growing up. And
Yeah.
so it's like, it's
Yeah.
not, and so it answered the question for me, like, did you know this person in the photo? I'm like,
Yeah.
no, I didn't, but I've had enough conversations to know that Ahmaud Arbery is a reflection of a larger mass experience that people that I love have had that
Yeah.
brings back all of those feelings, and it feels like it just happened all over again.
Yeah.
Because it just happened
Yeah.
all over again.
Yeah.
And so I think for us as the family of God, that's where I'm trying to go. I'm like, we're called to stand together in love. We're called to mourn with those who mourn. And so anyways, those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear more of yours. That's just, I'm like,
Yeah.
that's where my heart's at.
No, John, I think honestly, that's so good because this actually last week I did have like a conversation with someone that was sharing like some facts and different things about the case that honestly that I didn't know, and they were super helpful. And honestly, I didn't know because it's hard to just go there, like as a person of color, because like you said, like you see the list and you see something like this happening, and the only thing that you can think of is that could be me, or that could be my friend, or that could be my uncle, or you think, man, like for me as a Black woman, I absolutely already pray for if I have Black sons, you know, and I say this in like a joking way, but it's really true that if I married the whitest man tomorrow and had kids, my kid would still be Black. They're not viewed as half white, half Black. Like they're viewed as Black. So that's inevitable you know, unfortunately. And when you see something like this happen, now each time that something like this happens, it's a reminder of what is potentially to come, that this is still happening, and you get that break and you get that window that it's like, okay, no, like, whoa, nothing, you haven't heard anything, and then something like this happens, and it just brings it and it floods it all back. And I think I was feeling all of those things. So because I was feeling all of those things, I didn't even do digging or research into, you know, the case and why it took so, you know, which this person, a non-person of color, was trying to share with me. And because I just wasn't there yet. Like you said, like I was still trying to feel the things, and I was trying to feel it as a Christian in a way that is justice, and feel a righteous anger, and not let that righteous anger turn into just straight seeing red, obliterating unrighteous anger. And that's the one thing, because I was trying to figure out, I was like, at the end, I was like, this was good, but there was still something that was bothering me about the conversation. And I was actually in prayer about it before you even asked me to kind of sit in on this about it. And it was that I didn't feel the empathy. It was like, man, I would have been able to receive these facts probably even better and had a better dialogue with that person if that person just would have said like, hey, like how are you feeling? Like, are you okay? It's like, yes, these are facts, and yes, these are things, like, yes, and all of these things are important, but I would have so appreciated.
Did you know he was wearing boots, and did you know that he was actually in the house, and did you know, it's like, oh God, John is not at the cross saying, Mary, Mary, don't you know?
Yeah, it's like, there's a time and place for that conversation, but starting with the heart, recognizing that that person of color is feeling that. And unfortunately, and I do say this unfortunately, that is part of the privilege that of someone who looks like you. You have the privilege of being able to ignore, of like, okay, this doesn't pertain to me. You know what I mean? And it's not going to hit you emotionally in the same way as it does for someone that looks like me. And I say that unfortunately because it makes it harder to have these conversations and these dialogues. And I used to be that angry person. I used to be, where I couldn't portray and I couldn't say how I felt in a way that was actually productive to have conversations like this, because it was just so much anger. I didn't really allow the Lord in at that time on how to deal with my emotions with this, so that way I could be able to express that to someone in a way where we could have a dialogue and where education might need to happen, because they have no idea how much their comment was just so hurtful and they didn't understand. And I wanted to start to be able to communicate that and address that and in a way that that person could receive it. And anger is never the way. Anger is never the way to have that dialogue, even from a person of color. If I want to see my non POCs, persons of color, to really understand where we're coming from with this, I have to still speak in a way that they're open to that. And that doesn't mean I'm dumbing down the truth, but it does mean that I can still do that in a way with respect and with love, which Jesus calls and asks us to do, just the same as I want them to come to me with love and respect and not with the facts. First I want them to empathize with me. At the same time, as a person of color, I had to realize, if I actually want to see change happen in dialogues and I want to see mentalities change in people, non-people of color, I also still needed to not treat them as if they were the person that shot that person, or they were the person that choked out that person, or they were the person who called me the N-word, or whatever said thing might be. I had to realize that that's not them. They are coming to me because they actually want to know and they want to be educated, and it's an opportunity that I have. And by the grace of God, literally, I can do that because Jesus gives me everlasting peace and gives me love and compassion to be able to show that and convey those feelings and emotions. So, sorry, I'm like,
No, it's great. I mean, neither one. Just in case you're wondering, we didn't really prep. We're like, let's just have a dialogue like we would have a dialogue, and we'll just put it on camera and hope it helps people. So let me. There has been something. I hope I in some way parroted back some semblance. I was talking to my friend Ryan, and Ryan's a phenomenal singer, disciple, husband, father. He's also a person of color. He's a black guy. Yeah, the chocolate cherub. And so I was like, hey man, I'm gonna try to do this. And he was basically like, hey, it's just tiring to have to continually, thank you for being a white person that's at least trying. Yeah. It's just so hopefully I was at least somewhat helpful, even if you're like, you missed some stuff. But I've only gotten nominally helpful or understanding, or at least trying to understand, because I had friends and church family members who were people of color who were gracious enough to field my questions and share vulnerably and share their hearts. And so I think in a moment, in a space like this, in what can be an incredibly divided, and in the rest of the world, let's face it, we are dealing with an incredibly divided reality, not everywhere, but if there's ever a place for unity and reconciliation, it's a church. Yeah. Because we're family. Yeah. Because we've got the same dad, and he's in heaven. Yeah. And he not only has he called us to get along, and by the way, sermon series teaser, not get along in shallow ways, but get along in deep ways. Yes. Not only has he called us to it, but he has equipped us to be able to do it by his grace. Yeah. So it's like we kind of do have all of the ingredients needed to bake the cake. What it takes is, I think, a level of trust and humility on both sides. Yeah. I've got to be willing to say, I don't get this. Yeah. And no amount of me reading all the books and I've read all the articles and I've looked at all the facts, that's not enough. I have to be humble enough to say, I don't get this on an experiential level, and I need you to help me. And I need you to teach me. Yeah. And I need to sit in as a student. That takes humility on our part. Yeah. You need to have the humility to say, gosh, I'm exhausted, and I really don't want to have this conversation again. And are you serious that you need to Google Ahmad? You don't even know who Ahmad Arbery is. Are you kidding me? You're my brother. Yeah. I love you. You're trying. Yeah. Let's have this dialogue. And I do think that that's super important. And it's like, I think, for me, it's okay to, if you have the fatigue where it's like I've had that happen before, where it's like I've had now this conversation with multiple people, non-people of color in a day, and I need a break in a day, and I'm like, and I think that's okay. Which is why you ask, would you like to talk about it? Yes. And be okay if they're like, no, because maybe they've had 8 conversations already in the day. Yeah, and it's just like, and it's like, hey, I'm like, hey, you know what? Yes, I would like to have this conversation. Can we schedule for a different day? Because again, I want it to be
a helpful dialogue. I don't want it to be a debate. I don't want it to be a back and forth. I don't want it to be me shouting at you and putting off like my anger or anything at you. So it's totally okay if you're like overloaded, like take a break, pause, and then, schedule a different time where you can sit down and have that dialogue. And I would say, especially if you like follow Jesus, please be full of the Spirit. It's the only way that you're going to be able to have that dialogue. There is no, the only true model that has been able to do this is Jesus, that has seen just injustice after injustice before he even saw it amongst himself, by him dying on the cross when he did nothing wrong. But I think of like the adulterous woman who was having the stones thrown at her, and I can imagine as Jesus knows how, like, he loves her. He loves her. It's God's creation, and he's watching stones. Like, these are not pebbles, it's stones being thrown at her for something that she did, that honestly at that point in time, that was the right punishment, unfortunately, at that point in time for that. But it broke his heart to see her in pain, and he stood. And then he stood up for her and called it out of like, hey, if you've never sinned, how about you throw? You who haven't sinned, you cast the first stone. And everyone had to throw it down because we all have sinned. We've all fallen short except him. And it's just seeing that modeled out where he was able to tell the truth in love to this woman of like, hey, like your sins are forgiven and sin no more. Like, hey, like your sins are forgiven. Go out, live a better life. You don't have to live this way. And I think Jesus models that for us of where even us, y'all, we have fallen short too. Like even in our dialogue, in our ways of doing things, like he who cast the first stone, who hasn't, who maybe even out of myself, I know I have asked stupid questions at stupid times. I have said things that I'm like, oh, that wasn't right. And it wasn't related to race. It just could have been at work. It could have been anything. You know what I mean? And someone was gracious enough to take me to the side and was like, hey, Jaleesa, or I was able to ask someone like, hey, I think I just blew it. Can you give me feedback on that? And someone was compassionate enough to do that. John, as my boss, like I have dropped the ball and like probably worthy of like, all right, I think it's time for us to like sever ways, and he just hasn't done that. He's been gracious with me, like even as a boss. So I think, and that's what Jesus does with us, and I think we need to be reminded of that, honestly, sometimes as people of color, especially as Christians, that, man, Jesus has shown great compassion to us. Like other people have shown great compassion to us. Can we show other compassion to people in this area that is so hard to talk about, that they don't feel comfortable asking the questions, they don't know what to do? Can we be gracious enough to offer that extending hand, like what Jesus did with that woman of like, hey, let me come and let me tell you the truth in love, but also let me stand up for you, you know? And I think in ways, having dialogues like this, asking questions like that is people's way of doing that. I think people, non-people of color, their way of doing that, of trying to stand up, of trying to kind of like, hey, like, you're grieving and you're in pain. You've had stones thrown at you generationally when it comes to race. And like, they're not trying to be the savior or anything. They're just trying to like, hey, like if I can shield you, if I can help, if I can do anything, help me to understand how to do that and show that compassion towards you. And we have an opportunity to come alongside and to show them on how to do that, if that makes sense. So I think a question that I have for you is like, something that I've seen is, it's been hard for people, non-people of color, I've seen this, so like they feel like, hey, like, I can't relate to that, so let me not say anything. You know what I mean? Or like, I've seen like some posts, I've seen some different dialogues from people of like, hey, like, I stand for this, I totally think that this is wrong, but I'm not black, I don't want to come off insensitive, so then they choose to not say or do anything, maybe choose to not do the run that happened, on Friday, the 2.23 mile run that a lot of people in the country did. I've seen a lot of people do it, a lot of non-people of color do it, but then I've seen some that were like, hey, I can't relate, so let me just get complacent. Like, can you just speak to that? Like,
yeah, I mean, if I'm being honest, that's what I did initially.
Okay.
Because I thought that was,
why?
I thought that was the right thing.
But, okay, why?
I thought it was helpful.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, man, if I think if I can encapsulate my mentality the best, it's like, if I'm talking to our tech director about the audio frequencies that need to be best, whatever, I don't know about that. Like, that's not my area of expertise. That's not my, so I'm just gonna, I would be more harm than good. I would be more hurt than help. Let me just recuse myself and step out of that picture. And so I initially, it was out of a place of, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to be offensive. I don't want to like try to say something that I'm thinking helps the cause. And they're like, oh God, now you're perpetuating the problem. So it was out of, it was a mixture of like fear and not knowing. What actually shifted is when I had conversations with friends of color and they were like, oh, John, gosh, please say something. Like,
Yes.
say something. Like, can you please just say something? So when I and that's why I guess my thrust out of all of this, I'm like, what's the end goal of our conversation? It's not just like get woke. It's like woke is a moving target depending on generation, depending on worldview, depending on the current landscape. It's like, what I'm saying is get God's heart.
Yeah.
Because God's heart is not a moving target. It's clearly revealed in his word. And God's heart brings us back to family. So what shifted my approach was family, was real relationships with real people in my life, in our church, of color, who had, I'm like, you're hurting, talk to me. And they share.
So it was you reaching out after kind of like choosing to not take a, kind of like holding off because you didn't want to be insensitive. So then you reached out and asked, okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
I
that's helpful.
think it probably started when I was in Gainesville. Yeah, I think probably Ryan, honestly, might have been one of my first conversations. I was like, hey, man, here, can I, and I had deep relationship with him already, so there was trust. And I was like, hey, here are all my thoughts. And I like laid them out. I was like, what am I missing? And I had some things I was missing. And then he was like, hey, why haven't you said that? I'm like, I honestly didn't know. Like, would that help? Would that, he's like, yes, please say that. I was like, oh, okay. Great.
Yeah.
So it was just, and I think that's where I want to push people back to. It's not about, well, find your political party's thing, and it's like, at the end of the day, we follow Jesus. He's the King of Kings. That's what, but he's, connected us to one another.
Yeah.
So that would be my application step. It really would be like, what do we do from here? Respond like your friend and family member is hurting.
Yes.
Just like it's not rocket science.
Yep.
Just like any friend or family member who's hurting, respond just like that. Because your friends and family members of color right now probably are hurting.
Yeah.
Namely, ask me that question. Hey, I see you're really hurting. Would you like to talk about it? And then after you ask that, you listen.
Yep.
You feel, and then maybe you talk.
Yeah.
And so I think
that's so good. And if you don't mind, I'm gonna grab my phone really quick because there was actually a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. that I think would be just really helpful, just in with everything that's going on. So it's actually, and it's one of the quotes that's, if you've ever been to the memorial up in Washington, D.C., the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, it's there's a bunch of quotes that are kind of written around, and there were two that really stood out to me for this conversation. And just to throw this out there, historically, so even when you're talking about the civil rights movement, that was a combination of literally black and white brothers and sisters of all nationalities coming together. Yep. So the fact that John and I are even able to sit down and have this dialogue, the fact that I work at a church, that is diverse, that is full of multiple different races and different things, that was only feasible really because of the laws that were passed through that civil rights movement. And that movement happened
in church basements.
It was rooted in the church, it was rooted in the gospel, and so that's one, and it was also rooted in diversity. That happened. So just throwing that out there. But this is what Martin Luther King Jr. said. It's in his letter from Birmingham. So he wrote this in jail. So literally he's locked up for just protesting peacefully. Google it. But injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I'm gonna repeat that last part again. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So when non-people of color, when you stand up, when you ask questions, when you show compassion, when you show empathy to a person of color, you're living that out. That you're recognizing that, hey, maybe this won't happen, it's less likely to happen to me, but the fact that it is happening to anyone, the fact that anyone can get shot down by running, by jogging, by whatever it might be, even speaking back to some of the other cases where selling cigarettes or something on a street corner and then getting choked out, whatever it might be.
Skittles, whatever, yeah.
Any of those said things, that the fact that it can happen to anyone, no one deserves to die. No one deserves to die. And by you asking those questions, doing those things, you're saying that I am standing for an injustice everywhere, even if that injustice might not happen to me. And that is beautiful. And that is the gospel of Jesus standing up for injustice for everyone when he did no injustice. But he paid the price for it all. Sorry.
No, that's good. That's good.
And the other one is, the other quote is from Strength to Love in 1963. He said, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of convenience and comfort, but where he stands at time of challenge and controversy. So I would let that kind of especially resonate with you, especially non-people of color, but I think it's across the board with all of us, where it's easy for me to be convenient. For me, I'll speak as a person of color, and maybe you, if you want to speak as a non-person of color. For me, as a person of color, it is convenient and comfortable for me to not have dialogues and conversations because it does bring up wounds. It brings back. I thought of this, and it reminded me of just in September, I got called the N-word while standing and getting pizza. I did nothing. I wasn't a part of the disagreement.
Which, by the way, these are the type of stories that I heard. Every single person of color I talked to had multiple of those type of stories. To be like, yeah, we're just making something out of nothing. Unfortunately, we're not.
No, this was September of 2019. This just happened. I got called an N-word. Literally, I was standing in line. 2 other non-people of color were getting into an argument. I don't know how. Like, literally, he started to get angry, and I was just standing there. When I tell you I was doing nothing. I did one of these. I was like, oh, he's talking about me, because there was no other black person. There was no other person of color there except me, standing in line getting a pizza. So I think about, what if I would have reacted differently? Like, what would have happened, you know? But so seeing this happen of like, man, that easily could have been me if I had reacted differently. Like, what if I did get angry? What would he have done? Like, that's what I think of. And so seeing something like this reminds me of that. So it's comfortable. It's comfortable for me. It's convenient for me to not have these dialogues. But recognizing that this is a time of challenge, and it is a time of controversy, like what Martin Luther King Jr. is alluding to. And where I choose to stand in that does show my character. And I would rather my character stand for justice and reconciliation and education. I would rather stand on that. If that means me getting a little uncomfortable, being a little inconvenient, okay.
Yeah.
I think when I get to heaven, I don't think the Lord's gonna be like, I can't believe you. Like, I think he'll look at me and be like, well done, good and faithful servant, that you took the time to have those dialogues. So I don't know. What do you think?
No, that's great, Jaleesa. Thank you for sharing your heart and sharing honestly. And my hope is that we're getting ready to close it here, but my hope is that was helpful, at least to some degree. I'd say from my vantage point and my perspective, it's stepping into those moments of challenge and knowing, especially for me initially, it was like, man, I think my heart was I think I'm to some degree self-aware, and I'm sure there's other elements, but a lot of it was like, man, I just don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to be hurtful. I don't want to be unhelpful. And this is where Philippians 2 is helpful. It's like, don't only look out for your own interests.
Yeah, look out for the
If I'm being honest, I was looking out for my own interests. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I don't want to make it worse. It says, don't look out only for your own interests, but also for the interests of others. And I think for anyone that's not a person of color, we need to lovingly and courageously step into that zone. Jaleesa, maybe this hasn't been my experience, and that's part of the problem. It's a heartbreaking, differing realities.
Yeah.
But you're my sister, and if it's affecting and if it's hurting you, then it's affecting and it's hurting me, because we're family, and I want to learn and I want to hear. So I pray that God would give us grace as we walk this out, to love and to care deeply for one another. That he would continue to bring, that justice would roll down like a mighty river.
Yes.
And righteousness like a stream. So, Lord, we thank you for your grace. Help us to live this out.
Yes, God.
And church family, let's continue this dialogue in our online microchurches, in our
With
relationships, with friends. Let this be a jump-off point in the Spirit, by his grace. Love you, church, and we'll check you out online this week.
Guys.
See ya.